Welcome back to the Explainer, folks. Today, we're diving into a truly dramatic historical evolution. We're going to unpack the massive transformation of law enforcement in the Punjab region. We're charting a course from the early 1800s, which, let me tell you, was an era defined by brutal, unwritten laws and localized warlords, all the way to the establishment of the foundational Police Act of 1861. It is just a fascinating story of how modern, rigid bureaucratic structures are essentially forged out of sheer administrative necessity.
So here's our chronological roadmap for today. 1. Lawlessness and early rule. 2. The dual system experiment. 3. The crucible of 1857. 4. The push for reform. And finally, 5. Birth of modern policing.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, lawlessness and early rule.
To really anchor ourselves in time, picture this. It's the 18th century, the Mughal Empire is collapsing, and the region essentially falls into long, bitter, internecine warfare. Order was eventually forced by a Sikh chieftain named Ranjit Singh, famously known as the Lion of the Punjab. But his system of government, while totally held together by his immense personal energy, lacked any fixed constitution. So when he died in 1839, his empire tumbled down like a house of cards. What followed was 6 years of absolute strife, which ultimately led to conflicts with British forces, and finally, the British annexation of the Punjab in March 1849.
Now, you might be wondering, what did justice actually look like before that 1849 annexation? Well, it was incredibly rudimentary and, honestly, quite brutal. Just listen to this historical account. Money, fear, and favor could purchase an oath. There were no formal courts anywhere except for one in Lahore. Horrific ordeals, like making an accused person literally carry a heated plow or immersing them in boiling oil, were completely normal practices. Theft, cattle lifting, and violent robbery, which was known as dacoity, were just everyday occurrences. In fact, they were often treated with pride as hereditary professions, because immunity from the law could simply be bought. When the British took over, the colonial administrators obviously documented their own perspective of the region. Reading through the historical text, we can impartially observe how they framed the territory as a happy hunting ground for plunderers. The text characterizes the local population of the time through a very distinct colonial lens, describing them as this mixture of ravening wolves and helpless sheep. It's important to understand this context neutrally, because it shows the mindset of the administrators at the time. They viewed the creation of a reliable police force not just as a standard administrative task, but as an almost insurmountable challenge to conquer what they perceived as profound local disorder. Which brings us to part 2, the dual system experiment. Facing this vast new territory, the British definitely did not establish a modern police force overnight. Instead, they experimented. They split the force into 2 very distinct branches. On one side, you had a military preventive police. This was an organized, heavily armed force of infantry and cavalry, and their job was basically to crush resistance, guard the borders, and protect treasure. On the other side, you had a civil detective police. This was an independent section made up of city watchmen and a rural constabulary, and they focused on tracking criminals and serving routine processes. Let's break down how this dual system actually operated on the ground. The military side eventually grew to 10 massive military battalions, and in a very pragmatic move, the British actually enlisted disbanded old soldiers of the Sikh army who had remained faithful. They literally turned former adversaries into the backbone of their new security force. Meanwhile, on the civil side, the entire territory was carved up into 228 local police jurisdictions. At the head of these civil units was the Tehsildar, a local revenue officer who is now vested with police powers, managing a small force of about 30 men per unit. Okay, this is where it gets absolutely fascinating. Look at the specific historical details of how they policed the area. First, they actually employed indigenous cowherds. These guys grazed cattle in the jungles and had this peculiar, almost instinctive aptitude for tracking criminals simply by reading footprints in the wild. How wild is that? Secondly, there's a suppression of thuggery, a highly organized, incredibly deadly network of robbers and murderers. The Punjab Police created a dedicated branch that tracked these groups so relentlessly that by 1853, the brutal crime of thuggery was basically extinct in the region. Moving right along to part 3, the Crucible of 1857. I really want to emphasize this incredible statistic. 14,000. During the massive societal upheaval of the 1857 mutiny, a mere 14,000 policemen successfully kept internal peace across a massive stretch of territory, literally from the Himalayas down to the Indus River. And they did this while an estimated 50,000 disbanded armed soldiers were actively mingling within the society. It is just a staggering ratio that really highlights the sheer effectiveness of this newly minted experimental force under immense pressure. The source material refers to this period as a gigantic revolt in 1857, where rapine, crime, and disorder were just rampant in neighboring districts. Yet, as the historical documentation shows, the Punjab Police stood firm throughout this severe trial. They captured offenders, crushed sporadic outbreaks, and their native commandants were signally recognized and promoted for their conspicuously loyal service during all this widespread chaos. They absolutely proved their mettle. Now for part 4, the push for reform. So once peace and tranquility were finally restored, the harsh financial reality set in. The dual system, despite its undeniable success in 1857, was proving incredibly expensive to maintain. Plus, it completely lacked administrative harmony. You had totally separate individuals heading the military and civil branches, and the conflicting functions of a local magistrate and a superintendent of police, which were sometimes vested in one single individual, created deep bureaucratic friction. The colonial government quickly realized that an urgent, organic change was required. The solution to this mess was formalized in August 1860. That's when the Supreme Government appointed the Calcutta Police Commission. Their mandate was sweeping. They were to inquire into the entire question of police administration throughout all of British India. The primary goal? Draft a brand new bill, modeled heavily on the recently successful Madras Police Act, to standardize law enforcement once and for all. The commission was given 2 very direct, very immediate objectives. First up, ascertain the exact numbers and the true cost of all police and quasi-police currently serving. Basically, they needed to measure the bloat. Second, suggest concrete measures to either heavily reduce that expenditure or significantly increase efficiency. Their job was to bring financial and operational order to a bloated, overly localized system. And that leads us right into our final section, Part 5, Birth of Modern Policing. The recommendations the commission came back with were comprehensive and, honestly, a total game changer. They demanded the complete separation of military forces from civil constabularies. They insisted on centralized executive control rather than relying on local village headmen. They mandated uniform dress and standardized arms. But perhaps most critically, and this is huge, they demanded the complete severance of police officers from any judicial functions. This was a vital anti-corruption measure. It meant the people arresting you were no longer the same people judging you, directly addressing the massive abuses of earlier decades. All of these intensive reviews and drafts culminated shortly after, on March 26, 1861. The bill was officially passed into law as Act 5 of 1861. This monumental piece of legislation fundamentally remodeled the police in India, officially appointing Lieutenant Colonel H. Bruce as the very first Inspector General of Police to assist local governments in rolling out these sweeping changes. But the core legacy of that act was the new, strict hierarchy it established. The chaotic, localized control of the tehsildars was entirely replaced by a unified, top-down civil bureaucracy. Just look at this structure. At the very top, you have the Inspector General, appointed by the local government, responsible for overall efficiency. Right beneath him are the Deputy Inspector Generals for regional supervision. And on the ground, the District Superintendent, managing local jurisdictions. It created a clear, unbroken chain of command. To truly cement this new order, the Act mandated that every single police officer, upon appointment, receives a formal certificate under the seal of the Inspector General. Think about how massive a shift this is. If we contrast this new reality against the lawlessness of Ranjit Singh's era, where justice was bought and sold, we see that modern police powers, privileges, and discipline were now strictly codified. Authority was no longer derived from local warlords or hereditary right. It was legitimized by a standardized official certificate of appointment from a central government. So, we've traveled from an era of boiling oil ordeals and fragmented warlord rule through an incredibly tense dual military experiment, all the way to the creation of a rigid, top-down civil bureaucracy. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Look at the ranks, the centralized control, and the separation of powers introduced over 160 years ago. How did the bureaucratic structures established in the Colonial Police Act of 1861 still echo in the hierarchies and modern law enforcement institutions we interact with today? It's a fascinating legacy, born entirely out of chaos, that continues to shape the framework of order.